Good evening and welcome to the Canadian Orthodox Monastery and to Canadian Orthodox Broadcasting.ca. I'm here again with my colleague David Goa, and this evening we're going to speak a little bit about the modern version of an older phenomenon. We call it nihilism. I think in Britain it's called nihilism, and in America it's called nihilism. But the nihilistic movement from the 1800s reflects directly into our modern world and into contemporary society, and some of the issues that have been quite dramatic in our own time. Nihilism is a philosophical system, first of all, that advocates destruction without necessarily advocating any goal or any destiny or anything that should be accomplished at the end. And when this phenomenon really burst forth in Russia in the 1800s, the philosophy itself developed from the 1820s, but when Sergei Nechayev took over the movement in the 1860s, I think somewhere around 1865 or something, and gave it a kind of form, and even with another group developed what was called a catechism for nihilism. And the purpose of the nihilistic movement was simply to try to destroy the existing order, to destroy what existed now. There were movements at the same time, the Decembrist rebellion and others, that were actually seeking a constitutional monarchy, some perhaps even seeking a republic, in Russia. And when the government responded to this movement, it was quite a violent response. And somehow there was no attempt to look at the root causes of it, the movement itself, and the other movements that were going on in Russia at the time. The nihilists were very ascetic, and they were purist. In a way, perhaps thought they were purifying something by destroying what existed. But they actually had as their goal, ultimately, the assassination of the emperor, and finally succeeded in assassinating Alexander II. In the process, they created a reaction in the country that turned against any kind of meaningful reform or any movement toward any form of constitution. And that in itself helped to prepare the groundwork for the Russian Revolution, which was led by Alexander Kerensky and the Socialists, which collapsed into the Russian Civil War, in which the Bolshevists, or the Communists, actually took over and formed the Soviet Union. And in our own time, we also have movements that are dedicated to destruction without necessarily creating something or bringing something about. And David, I wonder to what degree the modern nihilist movements, things like the Al-Qaeda, also consider themselves purist and are somewhat ascetic and think of themselves as perhaps a hand of God or something in purifying, well, Islam and then the world, but have no concrete concept of what they could form in the place of what they're destroying. So I wonder if you could address that a bit.
Yeah. My sense is that there's a kind of intellectual and spiritual preparation that's at work in the creation of people who come to a nihilistic position. The way you described it in Russia is one of the ways this manifests itself. Another way is to have a utopian dream which cannot be embodied in the order of society as it is known, and that order must be wiped from the face of the earth before there's any chance for that utopian dream to be manifest. So we certainly see this in some forms of militant Islam, not all of them, but in some forms of militant Islam. The part that I've wondered about is not so much on the level of the ideology of those movements, but what is the spiritual preparation of the feet on the ground, the boots on the ground for the movement? How does it possibly come about that you can, in the name of Islam, that you can convince young people, mainly young men, but some young women as well, give them a kind of formation so that they, two things happen, it seems to me, become absolutely convinced that this world, the way it is meaningless, is without meaning and without the capacity to bear meaning. I mean, that has to occur. That kind of critique has to occur. And you have to ingest that. And then secondly, that the only meaning that they can tap into, the gateway to that meaning is destruction. The gateway to that meaning is to participate in the destruction of the normal order or the normative order in a particular society. Now, are there reasons to want to change the society? Want to change Saudi Arabia? Want to change Yemen? I mean, the list goes on. Well, of course there are. There is the history of colonialism. There is the way in which modern Western societies have viewed those societies as simply a gas tank, a place of extracting fossil fuels and leaving it at that. So of course there are always reasons, but those reasons are not, it seems to me, enough to explain this amazing way that people who are young, people who have their lives largely ahead of them, that they become convinced that the order that is must be wiped from the face of the earth in a kind of absolute way before something new can take place. So there is this kind of absolutism that's there, and there is this notion of purity, the need to purify, and to purify largely through destruction. One of the things that the architect, I suppose, the intellectual architect of Al-Qaeda, his brother was the teacher of Osama bin Laden. His name is Sayyid Qutb, Egyptian, executed actually in Egypt in the 60s. But Sayyid Qutb, there are others that have done this too, but he certainly made the case that the conditions of what he called Jalaliya, the conditions of a kind of paganism, he redefined how this was understood. He associated with Jalaliya, this pagan condition. He associated the leaders of the Muslim world with it. They were formally Muslims. I mean, in a formal way, they are Muslims. But he was able to read them into this picture of not just corruption, absolute decadence, and absolute contrariness to what he saw as what God wishes for the world. And then, of course, he also read into the Jalaliya those supporters of so much of the political leadership in the Arab world, particularly America, Israel, modern liberal democratic societies. Kutub, I mean, it's so interesting to me that so many of the leaders of that kind of movement come from the middle class or the wealthy classes in their part of the world. They virtually all have European and North American educations. They are not the poor. They are middle class. So I've wondered for a long time, what is it within our form of modernity, in modern democratic societies, in our conception of what constitutes the modern life? What is it that seeds the fields of enemy, of meaninglessness, and as a result makes it possible for nihilism to take hold? And there's a couple of things that are very striking to me, and I mean, scholars who've looked at this have certainly commented on it. And one of them is that our particular form of modernity, our sense of what it means to be a modern person, requires that you deconstruct any sense that life is more than chemistry, and that the understanding of the world requires anything more than technical reason, than simply what technical reason can tell us is real. So what's happened is there's been a sense, and this is a long story in the West, a sense that you become modern to the degree that you no longer, well, I'll put it in a nutshell, to the degree that you no longer have any way of regarding the wonder of life, the sheer wonder of life. That's poetry. Throw it away. The sheer wonder of life and the absolute marvel that human beings walk the face of the earth. And as we would say in our tradition, that every human being participates in the image of God. And of course in Islam, you have a similar notion. All human beings are the mirror of the divine. It doesn't matter whether they're Jalaliya or not. So this long process of diminishing the language of wonder, of saying that the human family needs to get rid of those traditional forms of expression, forms of regard, which speak to the wonder of life and which open us to the divine, to a sense that we have a relationship with the ineffable, which open us to have a regard for beauty. I mean, one of the interesting things about Russia, we were speaking about Russia, the same philosopher that wrote the Catechism for nihilists also wrote an attack on beauty. This extraordinary attack on beauty. So there's this long, tragic process, the way it worked itself out. Not simply to critique superstition and critique a kind of animate notion of the world and to critique people's foolish ideas about God. All of that, you and I would agree, needs to be done. The prophets, Jeremiah, Isaiah, Amos, Obadiah, Hosea, they all did that. But they did not do it as a way of completely clear-cutting the human mind and the human heart and robbing people of a language of wonder and a language of a regard and a sense that you are part of something. You are part of the world. You're not separate, isolated as a person. But what has happened, I think, is that a lot of modern education has done a pretty good job.
Indeed.
A pretty good job of creating what I call the fields of enemy. And so rising up in that comes nihilism, which is a kind of action, destructive action And for religious people who adopt this nihilism, it requires both the purity that you spoke about, and of course there are all these fantasies about what will happen after that, and that maybe something new will come in its place.
Yeah.
But you know, the first, just one more thing, the first suicide bombers, they were in Sri Lanka. And who were they? They were communists. They were Marxists in Sri Lanka who saw suicide bombing as the only way to push back the colonial forces because life seemed so appalling and so meaninglessness. So the only thing they could get was not only blowing themselves up, but blowing everybody else up too.
But it seems to be anyway that in, not even postmodern, but modern society as we developed, there's a little bit of a nihilism in the death of respect and reverence, even amongst human beings. And I mean the disappearance of the respect for the elderly, for one thing, or the reverence for those who had experience in life, that really has vanished. And even perhaps the apocalypticism, the world's coming to an end on the 21st of May. Why is it?
It's only 4 days away.
Right, but why is it? Well, unless you're still going by the Mayan calendar, we have 2 more years, or another year or so. But why is these apocalyptic movements? Because everything is hopeless and meaningless in this world. And the only thing that can solve it is for Christ to come back and destroy it. Because they're not, in the Orthodox perspective, there is no new world, no next world. If the scripture talks about another age.
The age to come.
The age to come. And in the symbol of faith, despite some of the mistranslations, it says, I believe in the age to come. It never says, I believe in the world to come. But not the destruction of the creation, and not the destruction of the universe, but transfiguration. Whereas most of the apocalyptic ideologies that we have are because the world is hopeless, meaningless, destined for nothing, that it'll all be destroyed, and everyone who's not one of us will be destroyed because we're the pure ones. And so the pure ones will be raptured, and then the impure ones will be left behind to be destroyed with the rest of the impurities. And the absence of really the regard for beauty, which isn't really taught in schools anymore. Once upon a time in our childhood we did have music appreciation, art appreciation, and some ideas about it. But even within the Orthodox Church, sometimes the reworking, and I won't say new translations, they're not, the reworking of the liturgical texts almost intentionally removes the beauty of the language and lowers it down to something that's concrete in a mechanistic way.
Yeah, it's that kind of mechanism.
Yeah, it's very mechanistic about the liturgy itself, that you can't have, and some people even despise the beauty of language. And so you reduce everything to the point that sometimes you abolish the prophecies in the Psalms because they're metaphoric. And the beauty of the language of metaphor is something that's intolerable because beauty is not appreciated. The poetry of it. But the regard for the world and for creation is poetic. And our relationship with beauty is always poetic.
Right.
And the destruction of the poetic heart, which comes along with this disregard for the beauty of language, is also a touch of nihilism, in my view, because there's something, it's reducing things down to a process rather than an ascension.
Yeah. There's a tragic history in Christianity around this, which is the ascendancy in the West of the notion that the biblical revelation is really a revelation about historical events,
Yeah.
and that Scripture is historically, has historical veracity, and that that's the revelation.
Yeah.
Instead of understanding that the revelation is the unveiling of the mystery of the human heart
Yeah.
and of human relationships. And so we've had this long process in the West of raising up technical reason, historical veracity, a kind of understanding that life is simply chemistry. And some of these are secular, of course, or would be the term that's commonly used. Others are actually profound reductions of religious worlds of understanding, and have an effect on language, a profound effect on language, and of course, most fundamentally, a profound effect on worship. Because what is worship? Worship is to stand there with your arms raised up in the stance of awe, which has two sides to it, both a recognition of our finitude, a profound encounter and recognition of our finitude, and the other side is the wonder of the creator of all that is, and the fact that we are, the fact that we be instead of be not. And my sense is that that language, which is really in one form or another, is there within many human cultures, some of them we would see as broken and not fulfilled as much as we would like to see, but it is part of the deep impulse of the human heart and the human mind to speak about how we recognize that our moment in life is deeply entwined with each other, with the past, and with the future. And that reducing it to anything is a kind of profanation.
That's obviously true, and the thing that also strikes me is how some of our own people try to avoid the issue of the divine energies and the human energies. But then the energy is about relationships. That's all that energy is. I mean, mechanically we define it as the ability to do work. Because something communicates to something, it moves it, and therefore work is done. But energy, both in physics and in Orthodox Christian theology, is about relationships.
Mm-hmm.
And when Christ said that the whole law and the prophets rest on relationship, the man with God, relationship of man with neighbor, relationships, the divine energies, and the proper use of our energies, is so profoundly central to Orthodox Christian understanding that when we talk about love your neighbor as yourself, it's our relationship with our neighbor, but the only way we can love our neighbor as ourselves is through empathy. And empathy is your energy reaching out, embracing the other person, and identifying them with yourself and yourself with them, and a kind of unity of what makes me weep makes him weep. And that seems to have somehow terribly gone missing, and we've fallen into a trap of the Protestant deconstructionism, where Christianity is reduced down to a moral code or a moral system with no transcendence.
Or we have the earlier form, which is to have a metaphysics which is completely abstract, and notions of ontology and being which are not dynamic.
Right.
Not dynamic at all. So it's in part that kind of intellectual abstraction that's part of Western thought that has led people, Nietzsche of course being perhaps the greatest example, and Martin Heidegger in the last 2 centuries, but this long history of trying to critique that. Well, I appreciate that. I think it should be critiqued, because being as a kind of abstraction is to lead us astray, because it is to suggest that our essence somehow lies outside relationship.
Bravo. That's
And
one of the
our
simple
essence
things.
is in relationship.
Yeah.
And so the nihilists, I think the whole development of nihilism is in many ways a reaction to that kind of metaphysical abstraction. And on that count, I think they're right.
Yeah.
Just as I think Nietzsche is right
Well,
about that.
Yeah, Nietzsche
But the
should
tragedy,
never be written off.
the tragedy is that understanding that being in relationship is really what we are about, and is really what I think the thirst is behind this.
Yeah.
And that's why we need to do our work far better than we've done.
Yes, and I really, about 20 years ago, was thinking about, came to the conclusion that since evil doesn't have being, it's not a thing. If it had being, it would mean that God created it. But evil is the absolute lack of empathy. And that's why...
The lack of relationship.
Yeah, the lack of any real empathy, and that Satan is totally non-empathetic to anyone or anything, and is the ultimate nihilist.
Yeah.
And that empathy is the beginning of the solution to evil. And when we see the incarnation of the living God, what we really see is the outpouring of God's empathy for mankind. And that's why the apostle says that we do not have a high priest. But let's rephrase it a little bit. We do not have a high priest who's incapable of profound empathy with all that makes us human, because he came down and touched it. Now, he might have always had that empathy, but we needed to know that. We needed to see that.
Yeah.
But really, the incarnation and the redemption of mankind is really a manifestation of God's empathy with mankind and calling us into a cooperative relationship with him. And without that,
Asking us to return to that.
to return to that kind of relationship, which also gives us the wonder of mystery and the awe of beauty.
Right.
And that the death of beauty is the beginning, in my view anyway, the death of beauty is the beginning of nihilism. That you can kill if you don't see the beauty in other people or other human beings,
You know, I have
or in the world around you.
I have a friend and a colleague who's now of blessed memory, who's a religious studies professor who has done quite a lot of work on war and on codes, warrior codes and what have you. And he, in his writing and in his lectures, has often made the point that human beings don't kill each other. You have to teach them to do it. And that is a process of deconditioning. It is a process of dehumanization. You have to teach people that others are not human.
Yeah.
It's the only way it works. So when we look at, say, Qutb, there's no question about the critique of modernity, the critique of the West, the critique of colonialism. The list goes on. Some of us can do that as good as he did or better. But he takes another turn. And that turn is anyone who is identified in any way with that is not human.
Yes. You know, there's such a profound difference between his approach, and of course Said Nursi also critiqued.
Right.
But look at the difference in the conclusions they came to.
Yeah, entirely.
And the directions they led people toward. And that's why I think it's rather sad that the Rizali Nur and Said Nursi are so unknown outside a portion of the Islamic world by the West, to see this other way of Islam looking at the rest of the world. And I really think that Said Nursi, I mean, in what I've read of him so far, he had some concept of the healing of the situation rather than destruction. And
he saw that as the major task of faithful Muslims, faithful Christians, faithful Jews. It's their shared major task, is how to find ways, particularly with the young, to help them recover their sense of being the mirror of the divine, to use the Quranic phrase for it, recover their sense of dignity, and to see that they actually count in the world. They mean something in the world. with my students, for example, I noticed a number of years ago, I think that many students come into our classes with a kind of low grade, and maybe sometimes not so low grade, certainly with a lot of enemy, and sometimes with a kind of low grade nihilism. And it is because they have never, I mean, to use an old biblical phrase, it's because they've never been blessed. They've never even heard a blessing.
Yeah.
And they haven't been blessed. They haven't been told in an open way, which is what a blessing is always open, isn't it? It doesn't define where you're supposed to go. It simply holds up the wonder of your being, and it says you belong.
Yeah.
You are here. You were meant to be. No matter how you came here, you were meant to be. And every child deserves to hear that.
Yeah.
Every child.
That's why it's so important to give children communion by name.
Yeah.
Because they have a name in the household.
That's
And
right.
that means they have significance in the household. And when we give a child communion by name on 40 days, and they have communion regularly, they grow up with the sense that they have meaning and place in the community of God, in the household of God. And because it's important to name them.
Yeah.
That you're not just something that floats by and takes communion. You're Alexander, you're Sophia, you're a human being with a personhood.
You are
that
particular and you belong.
Yeah.
And
No,
you're
really.
real.
Yeah, and that's why, Metropolitan Anthony Krapovitsky was reminding people that there's one common nature of all mankind, that we all share in it. This is the essence of mankind. And, in some of the schools of existentialism, and I think perhaps even one of the problems with personalism, is thinking that the individual is his own essence, or that he creates his own essence. And therefore he's not part of the common essence. I mean, he has his particularity, his what we would call in the Orthodox world a hypostasis, that he can actually shape and form and do things with. But that isn't his essence. His human essence is the common human nature that is all mankind, that makes us all common, that we're all united together in one way. And that in shaping our personhood, our hypostasis, we should think in terms of how that relates to the whole, and not isolate ourselves as being the sum total.
How do you respond to this way of putting it? I am David, particular history and all that sort of thing. You're Vedika Lazar. But our essence is here. It's not here. It's not there. It's here. It's between us.
Yeah.
It's the relationship that human beings have with each other.
Yeah.
That is the place, just as, of course, that is that amazing central teaching of the meaning of the Trinity.
Yeah. Well, and Metropolitan Anthony makes a similar point in his moral idea of the dogma of the Trinity. But also, when we look at the creation narrative, and the way it's looked at, it's almost catastrophic in a way. We see the three different creation stories about mankind. Well, maybe they're supposed to be, because each one is telling something different. When it's not good for man to be alone upon the earth, why? Because with whom does he have a physical relationship? I mean, his relationship with God is one thing, but with whom does he have a relationship of direct empathy? And then how does he extend outside of himself? And who is it that he can have unselfish love for?
So one of the things about the way in which we read that story, and one thing that we tend to forget, is that is a story about the human nature, not about a guy.
Yeah. Yeah.
The human nature exists, must have relationship.
Yeah.
It's not just a man and a woman, it's the human nature
Yeah.
that needs that kind of relationship.
Right, and the story about, first he created male and female. And the second time is telling a little bit about why it was necessary for there to be male and female. I mean, to be two. And one, to me, is a statement of some reality, and the other one is a prophecy of something to come. And the very fact that he says it's not good for man to be alone upon the earth, maybe male and female are being created, but then they want to emphasize this why. Why did there have to be two? And, okay, why create them so they could reproduce and everything? Because of course children are part of our salvation. Because when we have children, it brings out the greatest unselfish love within us. And brings us out of ourselves, and we reach out and we experience an empathy.
We finally discover that we aren't ourselves.
That we aren't.
That's really what happens.
It goes beyond.
We discover that what we are is the relationship.
Yeah, and I think that that nihilism has no reverence for the essence of mankind. There's some kind of fantasy of what could be if we destroy what is, and the other, well, we don't know what it is or where it might come from, but it might be there. But the main thing is to destroy the things that we see as, well, perhaps polluting the earth or being impure. And that's why in the movement in Russia, you know, the women who were nihilistic, I think, would usually dress in a long, formless gray dress. Sometimes they would have cuffs, white cuffs or something, the only decoration. They cut their hair short with no adornment. They generally didn't wear makeup of any kind. There was this Puritanism about it. And that kind of Puritanism says something about the problem with religious movements that think in terms of being Puritan, that think that you can attain moral perfection by following some code or law or rule, and that this is what the essence of Christianity is this purity of external life or something. But anytime there's this kind of Puritanism, and that we're the pure ones, or that we're becoming the pure ones, it seems to me that there's a little bit of